The storm clouds hung heavy above the ruined colony world, as the salvage crew picked their way through broken towers and twisted metal searching for anything of value that might still be hidden among the wrecks. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Calder, kept his eyes on the sky but his thoughts on the ground because survival in these dead zones depended on what you could carry back to the ship. He had worked long enough in this life to know that treasures often came in strange shapes and sometimes in dangerous ones too. When his boots clanged against the side of a half-buried escape pod, he paused and signaled his crew to stand ready. The pod door was dented inward as if struck from the outside, but faint light glimmered through a crack, and Calder swore he heard a faint sound from within. He pried the door open with a crowbar and the sound grew clearer, a whimper that did not belong to any machine. Inside, curled up beneath a torn emergency blanket, was a small figure, with silver skin streaked by grime, and large, trembling eyes that reflected the storm like pools of light. She could not have been more than a child, and yet there was something otherworldly about her, ridges on her cheeks and faint glowing patterns running down her arms. When Calder leaned close, she flinched back, clutching a broken toy to her chest as though it could protect her. For a long moment neither moved, and then she whispered words so soft he barely caught them. "Please, human, pretend to be my daddy for just one day." The crew exchanged looks of disbelief, because none of them had expected to find life here, and certainly not a child who spoke their tongue. Calder's rough heart stirred as he saw the fear in her eyes, and he thought of his own daughter long lost to war. Against the rules of salvage, against common sense, he lifted the frail girl into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, bones sharp under thin skin, yet she clung to him with desperate strength. He told his crew they would take her back to the ship, and though some grumbled about risk and bounty hunters, none dared challenge his command. The storm broke as they hurried across the shattered ground, rain striking like needles while lightning split the sky. The girl buried her face in Calder's chest and whispered, again about being her daddy for a single day, as if that was all she asked from life. Back aboard the freighter, the crew tried to question her, but she only answered in broken phrases. She remembered fire, noise, people leaving her behind. She remembered a voice telling her to hide and never come out until she heard someone who felt safe. To her, Calder's voice had been that safe sound. When food was offered, she ate carefully as though she had not seen a meal in days. The crew's medic checked her wounds and found nothing serious, but her body bore the marks of neglect. Calder sat by her bunk and tried to ask her name. She hesitated before whispering Lyra. It was the only word she spoke with certainty. That night, Calder could not sleep. The girl's request echoed in his mind. Pretend to be my daddy for just one day. He wondered what kind of life had taught her that a single day of kindness was all she could hope for. His crew debated quietly in the mess about what to do. Some wanted to leave her at the next port to avoid trouble. Others feared she was marked property of some noble house or dangerous faction. Yet when they thought of the way she clung to Calder, none of them could bring themselves to suggest abandoning her again. The freighter drifted through space, and in the silence of the stars, Calder made a quiet promise to himself that he would honor her wish, at least for now. The child slept soundly for the first time since they found her, the glow on her skin dimming to a soft pulse like the heartbeat of hope. Calder sat in the doorway watching her breathe, feeling the weight of a new responsibility settle on his shoulders. He told himself it was only for a day, but deep inside he knew nothing would ever be so simple again. Morning came with the soft hum of the freighter's engines as it moved through quiet space, and the crew gathered for breakfast, though their eyes often drifted toward the small cabin where the alien child now slept. Calder rose first and stepped inside to check on her. Lyra stirred under the thin blanket and blinked at him with those wide, luminous eyes that seemed to hold both fear and fragile hope. For a moment she looked as if she had forgotten where she was. Then recognition came and she reached for him. Calder lifted her gently and she clung to his neck, whispering again her strange plea that he pretend to be her daddy for one day. Calder gave a gruff smile and told her he could do that, at least until she felt safe. She seemed to brighten at his words, and for the first time he heard her laugh, a soft tinkling sound that silenced the doubts of every crew member listening from the corridor. The mess hall was a place of noise and rough humor, but that morning it grew quiet as Calder carried Lyra in. Plates of food steamed on the long table, and she sniffed curiously at the strange smells. When Calder set her down, she studied everything with cautious interest. One of the engineers slid a small plate of fruit toward her, and she hesitated before nibbling on a piece. Her eyes widened at the taste, and soon she ate with hungry delight, though always glancing back at Calder as if afraid he might vanish. The crew began to relax around her. Even the surliest among them cracked a smile when she tried to mimic their words, her accent strange but clear enough to show she understood more than she let on. Calder realized she was learning quickly, her mind sharp beneath the timid exterior. After the meal, he took her on a slow walk through the freighter to show her how things worked. He explained the doors, the control panels, the safety locks. She touched everything with fascination, asking the same question again and again. "What is this?" Calder answered patiently each time, surprised at his own willingness to teach. He had never been a man of many words, but with Lyra, he found himself explaining in detail. She listened with wide eyes, storing each word as though it were treasure. In the cargo bay, she found a battered crate and pretended it was a seat in a grand ship, waving her arms and declaring she was flying. Calder played along and steered an imaginary course while the rest of the crew watched, some shaking their heads but smiling nonetheless. Later, as the day wore on, Lyra sat beside Calder in the cockpit staring at the stars through the viewport. She told him in a halting voice about fragments of her past, how she remembered fire raining from the sky and people shouting. She remembered being pushed into the pod and told to stay quiet. She did not remember her parents' faces clearly, only their voices, and now she asked if he could speak to her like they once did. Calder swallowed hard and told her stories from his own childhood, simple tales of growing up on a farm world, of chasing stray animals and learning to fix machines. She listened with rapt attention, sometimes laughing, sometimes leaning close with a seriousness beyond her years. That evening, the crew gathered again, and someone produced an old toy, a carved wooden figure long forgotten in storage. Calder handed it to Lyra, and her face lit up. She hugged the toy tightly and whispered a thank you in her own language before repeating it in human tongue. The small gesture brought warmth to the room, breaking down barriers that had held the crew apart from her. For a moment, it felt as though they were more than a salvage team, as though they had become something like a family. Yet beneath the gentle laughter and the simple joy of that day, unease lingered. The strange glowing symbols on Lyra's skin seemed to shift faintly when she grew excited, patterns no one could read. The medic suggested it might be a genetic marker or a sign of her heritage. Calder stored the thought away but said nothing, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace. He reminded himself of her request and his promise to give her one day of being a daughter. As night fell and the freighter drifted on, Lyra curled up beside him with her toy in her arms and whispered that today had been the happiest she could remember. Calder laid a hand on her shoulder and felt the heavy truth that pretending might no longer be enough. The following days slipped by quietly as the freighter moved from one trade port to another, but the peace could not last because news had begun to spread across the sectors. In the crowded docking bays, Calder overheard merchants and pilots whispering about a child of strange blood who had vanished from the reach of a powerful house. They spoke of an aristocratic family mourning in silence and of hunters who had been paid to find the missing girl. Calder listened without showing reaction, but his mind tightened around the truth. The glowing lines on Lyra's skin, the way she spoke human tongue despite her young age, the desperation in her request for a father even for a day, all of it pointed to a story larger than anyone on his crew had wanted to face. When he returned to the ship, he found Lyra sitting with two engineers learning how to stack tools in neat rows and humming a tune she had picked up from one of them. Her innocent smile nearly broke his resolve to hide the danger from her. That evening, the crew gathered in the mess to discuss what to do. Rourke, the pilot, insisted they should leave her at the next neutral station and claim ignorance. The medic argued that she would not survive if she were handed over without care. Others feared the wrath of bounty hunters and enforcers. Calder listened to them but said little until their voices grew heated. Then he told them plain that they had found her, and that meant she was their responsibility. He reminded them of the oath they had once made to protect each other when no one else would. The crew quieted, though unease remained. Everyone knew that harboring a lost child of power could draw a noose around their necks. The decision was tested sooner than expected. As the freighter left the port, a patrol ship scanned their manifest more thoroughly than usual. Calder kept his voice calm as he answered questions, but sweat rolled down his back. Lyra hid in the maintenance crawl space, clutching her wooden toy, while one of the engineers whispered comfort through the grating. For long minutes, the patrol demanded codes and proof of cargo until finally, they waved the freighter off. The relief in the crew was sharp but brief because they all understood the patrol had been looking for something, or someone very specific. The shadow of pursuit now hung over every jump through space. That night Calder found Lyra staring at the stars again. She asked him if he was afraid. He told her he had been afraid many times, but fear was what kept people alive. She nodded solemnly as if she understood more than a child should. Then she asked him if he would still be her daddy even if bad people came. Calder hesitated only a moment before answering yes. He realized with surprise that he meant it. It was no longer just pretending. The bond had grown roots deeper than he had expected. The next morning sensors picked up a sleek vessel trailing them. The design was unmistakable. Black hull with crimson markings, the signature of a professional hunter. Rourke cursed under his breath while the crew scrambled to secure the ship. Calder studied the vessel on the screen and felt the weight of what was coming. This was no chance encounter. Someone had traced them and now the hunter was closing in. He ordered the crew to change course into a denser asteroid field, hoping to shake pursuit, but the hunter followed with expert precision. Lyra sensed the tension and clung to Calder's sleeve, asking softly if the bad men had come for her. Calder did not answer. His silence was answer enough. The freighter rattled as it slipped between rocks, engines groaning under the strain. The hunter's ship glided after them with the ease of a predator chasing prey. The crew worked frantically to mask their signals, but the gap continued to close. Calder stood firm at the command chair, his jaw set, his heart heavy. He had promised her safety for one day, but the day had already stretched into many and the cost was rising. Still, when he looked down at Lyra's frightened face, he knew there could be no turning back. Whether she was the lost child of a noble house or a pawn in some greater scheme, no hunter would take her while he still drew breath. The moment of decision had come, and Calder braced himself for the storm that would follow. The hunter's vessel circled like a hawk around the drifting freighter, and every member of the crew felt the weight of being prey. Calder ordered the shields raised, though they were little more than scrap metal patched together over years of service. The ship shuddered as warning shots flared across the bow, a reminder that the predator could strike whenever he wished. In the silence that followed, Calder heard the small voice of Lyra asking him not to let them take her. He knelt down beside her and promised again that he would not let her go. The words came without thought, firm and steady, and as he spoke them he realized he no longer considered the promise a game or a short duty. The bond between them had deepened into something more real than anything else in his drifting life. The hunter opened a channel, and his face appeared on the cracked holoscreen. He was tall and cold-eyed, his armor gleaming, his voice smooth with practiced menace. He claimed that the child belonged to a lineage beyond Calder's understanding, and that the bounty for her return would make kings of anyone who brought her back. He offered the crew a chance to surrender her peacefully and walk away with their lives. The silence in the mess was thick as the crew looked from Calder to Lyra and back again. Calder stood tall and told the hunter that the girl was under his protection. The hunter's smile was thin and cruel before the transmission cut off. The freighter jolted as magnetic grapples locked onto its hull. Armed drones began to crawl across the surface, cutting through exterior panels. Calder ordered the crew to arms, even though their weapons were old and mismatched. In the corridors, the men and women who had once lived only for salvage now prepared to defend a child they barely knew. Calder carried Lyra to the safest corner of the engine room and told her to stay hidden, no matter what happened. She grabbed his hand and begged him not to leave her, but he placed the wooden toy in her arms and promised to return. He walked away feeling the weight of her eyes on his back. Fighting broke out when the drones breached the hull. Sparks showered the corridors as plasma fire lit the gloom. The crew fought with desperate fury, holding line after line even as they were driven back. Calder moved like a storm through the chaos, his rage fueled by the memory of Lyra's whispered plea. He crushed one drone under a steel bar, shot another through the core, and rallied his people each time they faltered. The hunter himself entered the fray, a towering figure with energy blades in each hand, cutting through bulkheads as if they were paper. He moved with confidence, certain that his prey was already his. When the battle spilled into the engine room, Calder arrived just as the hunter cornered Lyra. She clutched the toy to her chest, tears streaking her silver skin. Calder stepped between them and raised his battered rifle. The hunter sneered, mocking him for pretending to be a father to something he did not understand. Calder answered not with words but with action, firing shot after shot and forcing the hunter back through sheer will. The crew joined in, surrounding the intruder, forcing him to retreat into the corridor. For the first time, the hunter looked less like a predator and more like a man surprised by resistance. The fight raged on until the crew triggered an emergency jump sequence, tearing the ship free from the grapples and flinging it into blind space. The freighter shook violently, alarms blaring, panels bursting with sparks. Yet when the stars stabilized outside the viewport, the hunter's ship was gone. The crew sagged with exhaustion and bruises, but the girl was safe. Calder found Lyra still in the engine room clutching the toy, her eyes wide with both terror and trust. She ran into his arms and whispered that he was not pretending anymore, that he truly was her daddy now. Calder felt the truth of her words strike deeper than any wound. In that moment, the role he had accepted as a passing kindness had become a duty. Etched into his soul, as the freighter drifted into silence, the crew gathered around them. They saw the way the girl clung to Calder and the way he held her as if she was blood of his own blood. No one spoke of abandoning her again. They had all seen what she meant to him and what he meant to her. They were bound together now by more than chance, by more than salvage. They were a family forged in fire, and every star in the galaxy would have to reckon with that bond. The crew patched the hull as best they could after the escape jump, but the scars of the battle still burned along the freighter's frame. Every clang of a hammer echoed with the memory of how close they had come to losing everything. Calder moved among his people, helping where he could, yet his mind never drifted far from Lyra. She followed him through the corridors, holding the carved toy like a shield. Her luminous eyes scanned every shadow as if expecting the hunter to appear again. Calder kept telling her she was safe, yet inside he knew safety was an illusion, because hunters never abandoned a quarry, and the bounty for her must be vast. At the next port, the truth of that bounty revealed itself. As the freighter settled into dock, Calder disguised Lyra under a hood and carried her in his arms. Merchants whispered louder now, repeating numbers that made men greedy. A sum high enough to buy fleets had been promised for the return of the lost child of the House of Valar. Calder recognized the name. The Valar ruled half a sector with cruel power, their bloodlines guarded as treasures. If Lyra bore their mark, then her abandonment was no accident but a crime of politics. That meant they would want her back, not for love, but for control. The crew debated in the mess until voices shook the metal walls. Some argued that they could not stand against the might of an empire. Others shouted that handing her over would be betrayal of every vow they had made. Calder listened with eyes hard as stone. When the shouting paused, he declared that no one would touch the girl. He said that he would bear the burden alone if he must. The room fell silent because they saw the fire in him, and they knew there was no turning him. Still fear gnawed at them all. It was not long before the hunter returned. His sleek vessel cut across the stars and sent a transmission demanding parley. He claimed the law was on his side, that the girl was property of her bloodline and that the crew would be branded criminals if they kept her. Calder met his gaze on the holoscreen and answered that the girl was not property, she was a child, and that no law written by tyrants could change that. The hunter's smile was sharper than any blade as he promised ruin. What followed was not just a battle of weapons but of will. The hunter pursued them across trade routes and through nebulae. Every time Calder thought they had shaken him, the predator reappeared. Supplies ran low and exhaustion wore on the crew, yet their resolve deepened. Lyra tried to help where she could, learning to carry tools, handing out water, whispering words of encouragement in her halting human speech. Her presence kept them moving when hope might have failed. In a desperate gamble, Calder lured the hunter into an asteroid belt, where shadows and debris masked the freighter's weaker engines. The hunter boarded once again, striding into the cargo hold with confidence, but this time the crew was ready. They laid traps with magnetic charges and false bulkheads, turning the ship itself into a weapon. Calder fought him face to face in the narrow space, steel against energy blade, rage against cold precision. The hunter taunted him, saying he was wasting his life on a child who was never his. Calder answered by driving him back step by step, every strike fueled by Lyra's whispered plea that he be her father. In the chaos, it was Lyra herself who turned the tide. She activated one of the traps Calder had shown her earlier, triggering a surge of power that crippled the hunter's armor. For a heartbeat, he stared at her in disbelief, as if unable to imagine that the child he hunted could strike him down. The crew swarmed him then, forcing him to retreat once more, leaving behind shattered pride and burning rage. The victory was narrow and costly. Hull plating was scorched, weapons nearly spent and morale worn thin. Yet as the freighter limped away from the battlefield, the crew looked upon Lyra not as cargo or burden, but as one of their own. They understood now that her survival was tied to theirs. Calder held her close and whispered that no matter the price they would keep her safe. She pressed her small hand against his cheek and told him she believed him. For the first time, Calder felt not only the duty of a promise, but the fierce pride of a father. Still, he knew the fight was far from over. The bounty had grown with every failed attempt, and soon the wrath of the Valar house itself would descend. Somewhere in the shifting glow of Lyra's skin was the secret reason she had been abandoned. Until that truth came to light, every day would be another battle for her right to live free. And Calder was ready to pay the price. The freighter drifted in the shadow of a dying star, its crew working in silence while the weight of recent battles pressed on them all. Calder stood at the viewport with Lyra beside him, her glowing skin reflecting faint light across the glass. He had begun to notice how the patterns shifted with her moods, flaring bright when she laughed and dimming when she felt fear. The medic studied those strange lines and finally admitted they were more than decoration. They were a genetic code, locked deep within her blood, a key to something larger than any of them had imagined. Rumors suggested that the Valar dynasty had been purging its own children, discarding those who carried a certain marker, because that marker could topple the balance of power. Calder now realized Lyra was not simply abandoned, she had been targeted to be erased. The revelation spread unease among the crew. Rourke cursed the day they had pulled her from the wreck, saying that they had invited the wrath of an empire onto their shoulders. Others argued that if she was truly dangerous, perhaps it was safer to let her go. Calder silenced them with a single command. He told them that danger or not, she was a child who deserved more than to be hunted like prey. He said he had made her a promise, and a promise was the last coin a man like him possessed. His voice carried such force that even the doubters lowered their heads. When Lyra overheard fragments of the conversation, she asked Calder if she was broken. He lifted her onto his knee and told her she was not broken, she was special. And sometimes people feared what was special, because it could not be controlled. She listened with wide, solemn eyes and then asked him if he would still be her daddy, even if the whole galaxy hated her. Calder's answer came without hesitation. He told her that he would be her daddy no matter what, that she had changed his life and that she gave him reason to fight. She wrapped her arms around him and whispered that she was not afraid anymore, as long as he stayed beside her, knowing the hunter and the empire would never stop. Calder formed a plan. If Lyra was the key to a hidden power, then the only way to protect her was to make her vanish. He would stage her death so thoroughly that no one could doubt it. To do so, he would need to sacrifice his own standing, painting himself as the one who destroyed her. The crew listened in silence as he explained, torn between horror and admiration. Some argued that the deception would never hold. Others admitted it was the only way to give the girl a chance at a real life. In the end, they agreed to stand with him because the bond that had grown among them was now as deep as blood. They traveled to a remote moon where Calder's old contacts lived, smugglers who owed him favors from wars long past. In the barren caverns, they prepared a decoy pod with traces of Lyra's DNA, enough to fool even the sharpest hunter. Lyra was hidden among refugees bound for a sanctuary world where the Empire's grasp was weak. Before she left, she clutched Calder's hand with tears in her eyes. She asked him if this meant their game of pretend was over. He told her it was never pretend, it had always been real, and that one day when the stars were kinder, he would find her again. She smiled through her tears and promised to remember. The sacrifice weighed heavy on everyone. The crew forged evidence of a desperate battle, broadcasting false signals that claimed Lyra had perished. Calder spread the story himself, branding his own name as the outlaw who had destroyed a treasure of the Valar bloodline. The hunter received the message with cold fury, swearing vengeance, but even he could not deny the proof. The Empire mourned and raged, their pursuit falling away in confusion. Calder stood on the deck as the false reports echoed across the channels, knowing that his own reputation was now ruined beyond repair. Yet in his heart he felt a strange peace because somewhere beyond their reach the girl lived and breathed free. The price was steep. One crew member did not survive the staged escape, a loyal engineer who sealed a door behind him so that the illusion of tragedy would be complete. Calder carried the memory of that sacrifice with grim respect. Lyra's freedom had been bought with blood and lies, but freedom it was. When the freighter slipped back into the dark currents of space, the crew was forever changed. They were no longer just salvagers scraping for survival. They had become guardians of a secret and a family bound by love and loss. Calder knew the galaxy would never forgive him, but when he remembered the way Lyra had called him Daddy, he understood that forgiveness was no longer what he sought. What mattered was that she would live, and that somewhere out there a child knew she had once been loved. The freighter floated through a stretch of silent space where no trade routes passed and no patrols searched, a place of exile where Calder and his crew could breathe at last. Yet the silence was heavy with memory because the cost of their choice weighed on every heart. The world believed the alien child had perished, and Calder carried the mark of a traitor branded by rumor and lies. To most of the galaxy, he was a criminal who had destroyed something priceless. But among his crew, he was more than that. He was the man who had stood between innocence and cruelty, and chosen love over fear. Days bled into weeks as they repaired the battered hull and tried to move forward. Calder carried himself with steady strength, though inside he often thought of Lyra, imagining her walking among strangers on some hidden sanctuary world, clutching her wooden toy, learning to laugh without fear. He told himself the sacrifice had been worth it, but the ache in his chest reminded him how much he missed the sound of her small voice calling him Daddy. The crew too felt the emptiness she left behind. Meals were quieter without her questions, corridors darker without her glow, but they never spoke of regret. They had given her life, and that was enough. One evening, Calder sat alone in the cockpit staring at the stars. He thought of how a man like him had once cared only for salvage and survival, and how a single whisper from a frightened child had rewritten everything he believed. He remembered her request that he pretend to be her daddy for just one day, and how that day had stretched into many until it became truth. He realized that the promise of one day had become a lifetime's worth of meaning, even if he could never see her again. The memory was enough to steady him when despair threatened to take hold. Not long after, word reached them that the hunter who had chased them so relentlessly had been disgraced for failing to recover the girl. The Valar house turned its wrath inward, purging rivals and sowing chaos. The crew listened to the broadcasts and knew that Lyra's survival, though hidden, had already begun to shift the balance of power. Somewhere in the galaxy, forces moved unknowingly, because a child still breathed when she should have been gone. Calder smiled faintly at the irony that a single life could shake dynasties, while the galaxy thought her ashes scattered in the void. As time passed, the crew made new routines. They returned to salvage runs, kept to remote sectors, avoided questions. Yet each of them carried something of Lyra in their hearts. The medics spoke more gently. The engineers laughed more freely. Even Rourke softened his sharp tongue. Calder noticed it all and understood that the girl had left them more than a memory. She had left them family. They were no longer lost souls drifting through space. They were people who had chosen to fight for someone who could not fight for herself, and that choice had given them purpose. One night, as the freighter glided past a nebula, Calder stood with his crew on the observation deck. The stars shimmered in the dust, and for a moment it felt as though Lyra's glow was with them again. Calder closed his eyes, and in his mind he heard her whisper the same words she had spoken on the day they met. "Please, human, pretend to be my daddy for just one day." He whispered back that it had never been pretend, that he had been proud to be her father, and that no empire, no hunter, no lie could ever erase that truth. The crew heard his words and bowed their heads in respect because they knew he was speaking not just for himself, but for them all. The freighter moved on, scarred but unbroken, carrying a story no one else would ever know. Somewhere far away, a little girl slept safely under alien skies, dreaming not of fear but of the warmth of a man who had held her and told her she was loved. Calder carried that image with him into every new dawn, a light brighter than any star. For him, the title of father had come from a whisper, but it had become the greatest honor of his life, and as long as he drew breath he would keep that memory alive. Proof that even in a galaxy of cruelty, a single promise could change everything. Years passed quietly as the freighter roamed from system to system, never staying long in one port, never daring to linger where questions might be asked. The crew grew older and their scars grew deeper, yet they carried on because survival was the only life they knew. Calder led them through storms of fire and voids of silence, but in his heart he carried more than duty. He carried the memory of a silver-skinned child who had once looked at him with trembling hope, and whispered a plea that had changed his life forever. "Please, human, pretend to be my daddy for just one day." That whisper had become the anchor of his soul. Every world they touched reminded him of her in some small way. A marketplace echoing with the laughter of children. A stormy night that mirrored the wreck where he first found her. The soft glow of bioluminescent creatures drifting through space. Each sight drew him back to the day he lifted her from ruin and promised her safety. He never spoke of it openly, yet every action he took was shaped by that vow. His crew knew it too. They had seen the way his eyes softened when he remembered her. They had felt the strength of the bond that had made them a family. In time, the legend of Calder, the outlaw, grew across the sectors. He was cursed as the man who destroyed a child of Valar blood and yet secretly admired as one who defied the Empire's cruelty. Smugglers told stories of him in hushed voices, painting him as a ghost who slipped through traps and struck at tyrants with cunning skill. Calder himself cared nothing for reputation. He knew the truth. The galaxy could think of him as a villain if it wished. What mattered was that somewhere a girl lived in peace because of his lies. That was enough. On a lonely night when the stars shimmered coldly outside the viewport, Calder sat alone in the cockpit. He held in his hands the small wooden toy Lyra had once clutched. The edges were worn smooth now from years of his touch, but the memory it carried had not faded. He thought of her smile, her laughter, her questions about the stars, her trust so freely given despite her fear. He whispered into the darkness that he missed her, and that no distance would ever erase the bond between them. For a moment he imagined he heard her whisper back, soft and gentle as it had been on that first night, calling him Daddy. The crew found him there and sat with him in silence. No one spoke because no words were needed. They had all shared in the story and carried it within them. They too believed that Lyra was alive somewhere, perhaps grown, perhaps strong, carrying forward the gift of love she had been given. Together they watched the nebula drift past, its glow painting their faces in shades of blue and gold. It felt like a blessing, a reminder that even in the darkest reaches of space hope could shine. Calder closed his eyes and let peace wash over him. He had given all he could, sacrificed all he had, yet gained something far greater. He had learned what it meant to be a father not by blood but by choice, and that choice had transformed a man of iron into a man of love. When he opened his eyes again, the stars seemed brighter. He gripped the toy once more and whispered that he would carry the memory until his last breath, and so the freighter moved on, scarred yet unbroken, carrying a crew bound by love and sacrifice, carrying a man who had found his soul in the whispered plea of an abandoned child. Somewhere out there, a girl walked beneath new skies alive and free, because he had chosen to protect her. That was his legacy, not the outlaw's name. The galaxy cursed, but the fatherhood he had embraced in the silence of the void. The end.